They're awesome. We love them. So, if you don't know me, I'm Nate. And with my beautiful wife, Mirren, we coordinate Move Youth here at Encounter. Woo! Come on. So at the moment, we're taking a break for the holidays, but we will be back in the coming weeks. What date was that again? 2nd of something. We will have some text sent out to our young people, text sent out to our adults regarding what's going to be going on for youth in 2025. I am very excited. We've got our youth leaders retreat coming up this week. All our youth leaders are going to come together. We're going to pray. We're going to see the vision. It's like a bit of a strategic Sunday, but over 3 days. And we get to really sow into our youth ministry, sow into our leaders, and just have a good time with it. It's very, very good. So let's kick it off. Over the past couple of weeks, we have been looking at, oh, thanks guys. I appreciate you. You're the best. We have been looking at Christlike. Christlike. We've explored what it means to reflect Jesus in our lives. So our first week, we looked at a Christlike life, speaking into how our lives should refresh others, build people up, and offer grace, not pressure. Our second week, a Christ-like gospel. How we should frame the gospel, how perspective matters. And if you're trying to seek a bit of relationship advice, go to week 3, a Christ-like marriage. Not only did we talk about marriage, we talked about relationship, the significance of singleness. So head back there. We've got the podcast. How cool is a podcast? How handy is that? I've been wanting that for a long time. I love podcasts. I'll listen to 2 or 3 each week. It's fantastic. Are you still with me? Week 4, we had a Christ-like Christmas, how we can be light divine and shine light in our lives. Week 5, we had a Christ-like you. What do you need to do to equip yourself for 2025? Now, it is already 2025, but I encourage you, go back and listen to that, how you can equip and empower yourself. Because it's not always about everyone else equipping and empowering you. It's about equipping and empowering yourself for 2025. And last week, Christ-like leader, Pastor Matt shared about how God is our shepherd. A Christ-like leader has God as their shepherd. A Christ-like leader is someone who is a sheep, not a goat. A sheep, not a goat. No one wants to be a goat. They're stinky. Our cousins used to have a goat. We called him, what was it, Jammy. We called him Jammy. And he was disgusting. He used to pee on his little beard and it would drip all nasty. Let's be sheep, not a goat. And it's a leader who leads with their voice, not a stick. Their voice, not a stick. And this week, someone say this week, we are going to be jumping into a more Christ-like grace. A grace that sees beyond flaws, extends compassion, and a grace that transforms lives through love and redemption. Let's pray. God, we just thank you for the opportunity that we can be here to learn a little bit more about you. God, I just pray that as I share a little bit about a Christ-like grace, that God, you'd be speaking through it. You'd turn my trash into your treasure, and God, that lives would be changed. God, we commit this to you. Amen. And let's not forget this powerful truth that we heard the first week. Pastor Robert Wiltshire. A more Christ-like life lightens the load, not adding to the burden. And that's what grace does. It lifts up. It sees beyond the flaws. It extends the compassion. It frees, it eases. But how do we work this out? How do we work this out? Has anyone ever been hacked on Facebook? No? Well, I have a pop who, I don't know what he does. He must be, I don't know, some high up famous person, but he gets hacked all the time. And I got a message from him 2 weeks ago, saying, oh, Nate, how are you? I've just got a new Facebook account and I just wanted to connect with you and just to see how you're going. I was like, oh, yeah, right, cool. I'll just leave it to the side. I'm not going to delete it. I'm not going to spend my time on some hacker. But give it another 2 days. There's a couple little question marks going, are you going to respond? And I was like, you know what? What I should have done really is just call Nan or call Pop and just say, hey, is this you? But instead, I thought I'd just have a bit of a look and, you know what, have some light conversation. Nothing is going to be incriminating myself. So we started conversing, and it seemed pretty legit until he asked the question, hey, you know what? Did you know that you're enrolled in the DHHS scheme, and do you know what you need to do next? As soon as I heard that, my blood boiled. I don't get angry often. I really don't. I'm a pretty light guy. I won't get fazed. But when it comes to this, when it comes to discriminating people and exploiting people, I don't like it. I don't like it at all. So I did what everyone else does, and I wrote out a massive paragraph of how they should reconsider their life choices, and you don't want to hear the rest of it. Honestly, it was, you wouldn't feel like a good person after reading it. So I don't know if anyone does this, but I wrote it out and then I just sat on it for a while. I gave it 3 or 4 days and just left it there. And then they started asking different questions, and there's a couple more texts that came through, and I was like, you know what, I'm just going to send it. But before I sent it, I was like, I'll just ask my wife, and you know what, look at this. This is a situation. Pop's been hacked a couple times. Is this message fair? To which the wonderful image of grace that Mirren is said, no. Nah, you don't know their situation. You don't know what they've been through. You don't know the circumstance that's led them to this moment. You don't know if they've been forced to do this. You don't know if this is their last cry for help, for redemption, for something from some, like this may be their only method of income. And man, that hit me hard. But grace matters because it shifts our focus from judgment to compassion. From judgment to compassion. When Jesus encountered sinners, he didn't lead with condemnation, he led with love. And a perfect example of this is found in Luke 19, verse 1 to 10. Now, this is the story of Zacchaeus. So if you have your iPad, your iPhone, or eyelids, let's flick over to this. There's going to be a little bit of Bible, but we're going to read through it. I think it's really worth it. It sort of embodies what a Christ-like grace is like. So Luke 19, verse 1 to 10, let's read. Jesus entered Jericho and made his way through the town. There was a man there named Zacchaeus. He was the chief tax collector in the region, and he'd become very rich. He tried to get a good look at Jesus, but he was too short to see over the crowd. Now, I had a little bit of look of, normally I just gloss over, oh yeah, Zacchaeus was a tax collector, but he wasn't only just a tax collector, he was a chief tax collector. And what was a tax collector back in the day? Well, tax collectors were people who were employed by the Romans, the people who were in charge of Israel at the time, to collect the taxes. Pretty simple, yeah? But there was a lot of weight in his position. Not only was he a tax collector, but he was a chief tax collector. So he was overseeing the tax collectors of the time. So not only did he take, they were pretty well known for taking just a little bit extra, just a little bit on top. The Romans didn't care. They got their money. They just took a little bit on top. But being a chief tax collector, he must have taken a fair chunk because obviously it says he's pretty darn rich. So jumping back into verse 5, when Jesus came by, he looked up Zacchaeus and called by his name. Zacchaeus, he said. Now, I don't think it was really that sort of emotion. Let's go to the next slide. I had a bit of a look at what a sycamore fig tree looked like. Now, this is a sycamore fig tree. As you can see, it's fairly tall. Now, the average sycamore fig tree would be 15 to 25 meters, can go up to 30 meters. And there was a massive crowd as well. So what it would have been is a little bit more like, Zacchaeus, please come down, because I'm coming to your house today. Zacchaeus quickly climbed down and took Jesus to his house in great excitement and joy. But the people were displeased. He has gone to be the guest of a notorious sinner, they grumbled. Meanwhile, Zacchaeus stood before the Lord and said, I'll give half my wealth to the poor. I'll give half my wealth to the poor. Lord, and if I've cheated people on their taxes, I'll give them back 4 times as much. Jesus responded, salvation has come to this home today, for this man has shown himself to be a true son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and save those who are lost. Imagine what life was like for Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus was wealthy. He was rich, but at what cost? At what cost? Imagine the social isolation that came with the riches that he had. He was pretty likely to be excluded from the synagogue worship, excluded from his home, excluded from his family, excluded from the people who were around him. People just did not want to be around him. And the whispers that would carry on through the day as people were like, oh man, that guy Zacchaeus, like, I just can't pay for my mortgage. I can't pay for my home anymore. I reckon he's taking a little bit extra again. Oh, this guy Zacchaeus, I can't deal with him. I can't believe his family let him be a tax collector. It would be pretty well crippling. Despite his material wealth, he likely carried a heavy burden of loneliness, rejection, and shame. Now, Jericho was a pretty prosperous city. It was considered to be the epicenter of trade and commerce. Being stationed there as a tax collector would have kept his pockets fairly full. Yet Zacchaeus climbed up the social ladder. As he climbed up the social ladder, as he went from a tax collector to a chief tax collector, that alienated him further from his family, his friends, and the people around him. Wealth couldn't buy acceptance. Wealth couldn't buy grace. Wealth couldn't buy purpose. His act of climbing up the sycamore tree wasn't just an opportunity to come and see this random guy who was in there. It was his climb and desperation for acceptance, his desperation to see someone who loved him more than anyone who could. Because he was at the peak of his game. He was making the most money out of everyone. He was probably living in the nicest house. But he knew that there was something more. He knew he wanted to get a glimpse of someone or something that could offer more than money could ever. When Jesus entered Jericho and saw Zacchaeus, everything changed. The crowd must have been pretty darn shocked when Jesus stopped and called out Zacchaeus' name. And furthermore, they must have been shocked when Jesus invited himself over to his house. Now, that's pretty significant because when he came over to his house and shared a meal, when you share a meal back in that day, is to say that they're equal. It's to say that they have value, that they have a statement where they're at. It was Jesus publicly declaring that Zacchaeus was worth it, even despite his reputation. And think about the ripple effect that had on Zacchaeus' life. Zacchaeus didn't just feel seen. He felt and was transformed. His response wasn't just mere words, but it was action. It was, Lord, look, here now I give half of my possessions to the poor. And if I have cheated anyone out of anything, I'll pay them back 4 times the amount. And you know what? This wasn't required by law. The Romans, they didn't care. They got their money, they got their cut, but they didn't care. So he didn't have to pay back anything. Even in the Jewish law, he didn't have to pay back anything. But it's amazing what grace can do. Zacchaeus went above and beyond, driven by a heart by changed by grace. Zacchaeus' story shows us that grace doesn't condone wrongdoing. Grace doesn't condone wrongdoing, but it opens up a door for repentance and redemption. Jesus' grace, it didn't ignore Zacchaeus' wrongdoing. It addressed them in a way that led to true transformation. Grace matters because it's the key to unlocking change in us and in others. Who knows that grace doesn't only change and transform other people, but it changes us at a heart level. So how do we have a Christ-like grace? A grace that sees beyond flaws, extends compassion, and transforms lives through love and redemption. If you're taking notes this morning, I encourage you to do so. I definitely do it so I don't fall asleep. It's just one of my things. If I'm sitting down and I'm comfy, I just start dozing off. So if you're taking notes this morning, first point for this morning to have a Christ-like grace is to stop and to think. When you're wronged by someone, when someone does something that rubs you up the wrong way, what's your response? Is it grace? Is it compassion? Or is it sort of like me in the hacker? Is it absolute anger, distaste for the person? What is your response? In Proverbs 19, verse 11, Solomon writes, "A person's wisdom yields patience. It is one's glory to overlook an offense." And before we draw conclusions, we have to ask ourselves, what might their story be? Have they been hurt? Have they been misled? Have they been forced? What's the acting force behind what they're doing? We don't naturally want to bring darkness into the world. I don't think anyone here naturally wants to bring decrease to people's lives. So we have to pause and empathize, because empathy unlocks grace. Empathy unlocks grace. Think of Zacchaeus. Jesus could have judged him like everybody else was, but instead, he looked deeper and saw a man searching for something greater. Someone who'd made it to the top of the rank, but knew there was something better for his life, something worth living for. Let's put ourselves in Zacchaeus' boots. Job of a tax collector was appointed by the Romans, and then the Jewish people, they would bid to get the job. So the Romans were just making more money again. So they would bid to get the job. But as a Jewish person, Zacchaeus was obviously in a Jewish family as well. And the Jews they had a severe distaste to those people. They didn't like them at all. So to be a tax collector, Zacchaeus would have had to be in a very awkward situation to be there. And let's be honest. What would have led him to be a tax collector? What would have led Zacchaeus to be a tax collector? Everyone else don't know his story. Maybe his family was just out of luck, didn't have enough money to support, didn't have enough money for food, didn't have money to build their house, whatever it may have been. Maybe they were forced to gather everything they had to bid him into the position that he was appointed. Perhaps Zacchaeus entered his role with reluctancy, burdened by the weight of his family's need and the social rejection. Imagine the loneliness that Zacchaeus endured. Ostracized by his community, alienated from his faith, and labelled a traitor. Despite his wealth, his soul must have been starving for connection and purpose. So now we have a bit of a better glimpse of what Zacchaeus' life might be. Now, we're never going to fully understand his circumstances, but we can just see how profound Jesus' actions were. When Jesus looked up at Zacchaeus in the sycamore tree and called him by name, it wasn't just an invitation, but it was a restoration. Jesus saw past Zacchaeus' reputation and into his heart. He didn't see a corrupt tax collector. He saw a man ready for redemption. And at the end of the day, we're never going to know someone's full story. Not at all. But what we can do, before we assume the worst of someone, let's stop and think of all the possibilities. What pain might they be carrying? What circumstances might have shaped where they're at? And let's just choose to give them the benefit of the doubt. Let's choose grace to be more Christ-like. So point number 2, if you're taking notes, remember, we need grace. You know what? I'm not perfect. And whoever here is perfect, I've got a lot of questions, and I'll meet you after. It's so easy to forget that we've all been like Zacchaeus. We've all fallen short at some point of the day. We've all made mistakes, and we're all in need for grace. Paul writes in Ephesians 2, verse 8, "For it is by grace that you have been saved, through faith. And this is not from yourselves, it is a gift from God." Turns out God's not just up there with the big old stick counting your rights and wrongs and waiting for you to stuff up. But as we can see, when God came to Jeremiah and said, before you were formed in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I sanctified you and ordained you as a prophet to the nations. And the same thing applies to us. Before he knew us, before we were born, he has set apart us. He's already accepted us. He's already given us that grace. Before we had a chance to stuff it up, he sanctified us. So that word sanctified means to be set apart, to be declared holy, to be sacred. be sacred. Remember, we're not perfect. You and I both need grace. Think of the moments that you've been forgiven, that you've been showed grace despite your shortcomings. I can think of plenty. So many. And let's just hold on to that for a second. Imagine if every circumstance that we came in, that we showed that same grace to other people. That we show that same grace to other people. Grace reminds us that none of us are perfect. All of us are in need of love and mercy. It's a powerful tool that can shift perspectives and bring light into the darkest of situations. Grace is not just about what we receive, it's about what we give. When we choose grace, we choose to reflect God's character in a world that often thrives of judgment and condemnation. It's about letting go of the need to be right, the need to retaliate, and instead choosing to uplift, to forgive and bring life and love. This grace is transformative, both for the giver and the receiver. And it turns out it's what turns a broken world to a redeemed one act of grace at a time. The third point, having Christ-like grace means that we choose to be Jesus in the moment. We choose to be Jesus. If it hadn't been for Mirren, I definitely would have shown grace. Jesus' encounter with Zacchaeus, that's a perfect example of what grace is like, of having a Christ-like grace, how we should respond to others. He didn't just see Zacchaeus as he was. He saw Zacchaeus as who he could become. He saw the potential in Zacchaeus. He didn't just see Zacchaeus as he was. He saw Zacchaeus and who he could become. This is what it means to be Jesus to others. To see past the surface and speak into the potential in people. To see through his eyes with hope, with mercy, and a willingness to forgive. Think about the impact of that kind of love. It doesn't just change the other person, it changes us too. It draws us closer to God's heart and his purpose for our lives. It draws the other person closer to God's heart and his purpose for their lives. Imagine what it would look like if every situation we pause and ask, how would Jesus respond? What would Jesus do? Would he respond with grace or anger? Would he respond with love or rejection? Every time that we choose grace, we align ourselves more closely with his example. And let's be honest, it's not always easy, it's hard. When people have rubbed you up the wrong way, when they've done you wrong, you don't want to give them anything, you chuck a wall up. You walk away. You don't want to be part of that situation. But we have an opportunity. It's moments like that where we can grow, that we can become more Christ-like and shine light into this world. A more Christ-like grace. A few questions we can ask. Who in your life needs to experience grace right now, and how can you extend it to them? Think about someone in your world who maybe, like the hacker in Pop's situation, in my situation with Pop. Maybe someone who's rubbed you up the wrong way, or maybe it's the opposite. You've rubbed them up the wrong way and you don't know how to act. How can you extend grace? Who in your life needs to experience grace right now? What would happen if instead of responding with judgment or anger, we chose to extend grace, like Christ-like grace? How could a single act of compassion bring healing or transformation to your relationships? Who is your Zacchaeus? Who is your Zacchaeus? We need to actively thinking about that. How can we extend grace? Another question that we could ask is, how can you practice empathy this week? Especially with someone who frustrates you or offends you. In Pop's story, my initial reaction was anger. I assumed the worst, but Mirren brought that transformation to my life and reminded me to ask, what might they be going through? What's their story? Empathy is about seeing people through the lens of the humanity, not just their actions. Think about Zacchaeus again. When Jesus looked at him, he didn't see a corrupt tax collector. He saw past that. He saw a man who was yearning, calling out for something greater. A man willing to climb a tree just to catch a glimpse of hope. Is there someone in your life who has frustrated you or offended you recently? maybe a co-worker, a family member, someone on your footy team, someone who's just difficult to deal with. How can you shift your focus from what they've done to what they might be going through? Ask yourself, what tree is this person climbing? What struggle and insecurities could be their driving behavior? Let that perspective guide you, your response. Change your focus. Fix your lens. As we have the band up. Another question. Last question. What would it look like to reflect Jesus in a difficult situation that you're currently facing? We all have moments where the first instinct is to defend, is to put a wall up, is to fight back or to run away. But in those moments, Jesus has set the example that we need to actually step into that situation with grace. I know it's hard. It's not easy. Even when it's hard, we've got to do it. Think back to how Jesus approached Zacchaeus. He didn't ignore the crowd's judgment. They were shouting out. Or even Zacchaeus' mistakes, because they were valid. But he chose to reflect God's heart by leading with love instead of condemnation. The act of grace transformed Zacchaeus' life. Imagine the opportunities that we have to transform lives bit by bit. Now, it doesn't have to be a radical transformation, but maybe it's just a 1%er. What would it look like to reflect Jesus in that moment? Could it be holding back anger and offering understanding instead? Could it be showing kindness to someone who doesn't deserve it? Because a lot of the time it feels like people don't deserve it. Could it be speaking truth but in love with the goal of restoration? The goal of restoration, the goal of transformation. Now in the end, I didn't send the angry message to the hacker. And that simple choice turned my response from retaliation to one of grace. What response can you choose this week that will point others to Jesus? Like Jesus pointed Zacchaeus to a better future. In closing, just to wrap it up, let's condense it into a few sentences. So to have more Christ-like grace is to stop and to think. What might be their story? To remember the grace that we've already been shown by others and by God. And to actively choose to be Jesus in the moment. Like my wife tells me, think the best of people. Think the best of people. You don't know their story. Think the best of people. Offer grace. Grace isn't just a gift that we receive. It's a gift that we give. Zacchaeus' story reminds us that no one is beyond the reach of grace. And sometimes all it takes is one act of kindness just to spark transformation. As Pastor Rob said, a more Christ-like life lightens the load, not adding to the burden. This week, let's lighten the load for someone else. A more Christ-like grace sees beyond flaws, extends compassion, and transforms lives through love and redemption. Let's show grace, be Jesus, and watch as lives are changed, starting with your own. Let's pray. God, we just thank you for the opportunity that we have to extend grace. God, we just thank you that we can be Jesus to people. To show that there is a better way of life, that we don't have to let people sit in their Zacchaeus. But they can step out, they can step up and see the glory of who you are. God, I just pray that as we go on our week that we represent you well. And God, that we stop and think, that we remember the grace that's been shown to us. And that we continue to have Christ-like grace. Amen.
How good is that? A more Christ-like grace. Who's been enjoying our Christ-like series? It's been so good, the different topics we've been able to focus on with intention. So as you go into this week, let's intentionally focus on showing grace and being grateful for when we receive grace, because who knows, we all need it. It's so good. Well, as we begin to close the service, I've got a couple of reminders for us. We have them up on there. We have our Australia Day lunch, our family lunch on Jan 26th, and it is bring food of your culture. It's going to be so good getting together and celebrating as a family, as your own unique parts. So bring something from your culture. Strategic Sunday, we saw the video. It's going to be amazing. It is going to be family-filled and fun. I know the kids were going to do something fun. I don't know yet, but it's going to be amazing. It's going to be a family service, so bring your kids, bring your family along, and let's get ready for the year. We also have Numurkah starting back next week. So for those of you interested, 4 p.m. in Numurkah. I don't know the actual address, but go to the hub and it will be on there. Don't forget, jump on that podcast. It will have all of these messages. You can listen back, take notes, and get reminded about everything that we've been speaking about. And we have I Love My Church on the 1st of February. That's just, we're going to come here, a bit of a working bee. We're going to hang out, have lunch, and it's going to be awesome. So if you would all like to stand with me, we are going to finish on a lovely praise song.